My lady, please may I call Professor Emerita Gillian McCluskey.
Thank you.
I swear by Almighty God
I swear by Almighty God
that the evidence I shall give
that the evidence I shall give
shall be the truth,
shall be the truth,
the whole truth,
the whole truth,
and nothing but the truth.
and nothing but the truth.
Thank you, please sit down.
Thank you for coming along to help us, Professor.
Thank you, lady.
Can I ask you to give your full name to the inquiry, please?
Professor Gillian McCluskey.
And can I just check that you have in front of you, please, your expert report, which I think runs to 296 pages, Professor.
I do, thank you.
Does that bear the number INQ 000 587 959?
Thank you, it does.
And can you confirm that any of the facts that are stated in that report are true to the best of your knowledge and belief?
They are.
And can you also confirm that any opinion that you have stated in that report is an opinion which is the true and complete professional opinion?
It is.
Of you. Thank you. It's right to say that this almost 300-page report has been authored by, in fact, 3 different academics. Is that correct? Of which you are one. And insofar as there are 2 other lead authors, the first is Professor Cathy Lewin. Is that correct?
Yes, that's right.
And she's a Professor of Education at Manchester Metropolitan University, specialising in educational technology. Is that right?
That's right.
And the other lead author is Professor Jo van Herwegen, is that correct? Who's a Professor of Developmental Psychology at University College London.
That's right.
Right. And she has a special research interest and specialisation in the provision and education provision and outcomes for students with special educational needs. Is that correct?
It is.
And then may I ask you, please, a bit about your expertise, Professor McCluskey, in this field?
I was the lead author for a number of reports, including the Central Report on Education and its impacts for the Scottish COVID public inquiry. And my broader research looks at education in the round, and particularly the challenges for children who have got barriers to learning in whatever way that presents itself.
All right. I was going to ask to begin with about an observation that you make at paragraph 41 about the different parts of the United Kingdom, and that your research for the inquiry looking at education during the pandemic found that there were greater commonalities than there were dissimilarities. First of all, is that correct?
That is correct, yes, it is.
And I think it's important to say about this report, it is a report that covers the whole of the United Kingdom, isn't it?
It is.
So in each of the areas that you've looked at, you've sought to ascertain what research exists in each part of the United Kingdom in order to help you arrive at conclusions. Is that right?
That's exactly what we tried to do. It's fair to say that England, by its very nature, because it's much larger, has a very much larger body of research overall. And it's also fair to say that, for instance, Northern Ireland has a relatively small body of research. But yes, in each case, we tried to establish what research was available and the weight of that research, the rigour of it as well.
And just standing back from the enormous detail of your report and just trying to set out what the commonalities were, can I ask you about each of these? So first, in terms of the policy interventions that were implemented by each of the governments in the United Kingdom, insofar as they all closed schools to most children, did they do so at broadly the same times as each other?
In broad terms, yes, they did. They each had a commitment to closing schools to most pupils. They each had a commitment to ensuring continuity of in-person support as far as possible for vulnerable and disadvantaged children and for the children of key workers. And they all moved to remote learning in different forms at approximately the same times, given that there are different school holidays and things vary
Yes,
a
of
bit over.
course.
But in general terms, absolutely, yes.
And in terms of that vulnerable children policy that each implemented so that children could come to school, is it correct that there is some variation in the detail of that policy across each of the parts of the United Kingdom?
Yes, for historical reasons, policy reasons, the approach to defining vulnerability generally, even before we think about education, is quite complex and messy. And that plays out to some extent in the ways in which vulnerability was understood pre-pandemic across the jurisdictions of the UK. But the policy contexts have always been slightly different. But I think that the key thing is that each of the jurisdictions recognise the need to respond to children who were vulnerable. There were differences, but that there was a genuine, I think, and principled attempt to understand that children with additional levels of vulnerability needed extra support.
And did each part of the United Kingdom also have within their policy a discretion that it afforded to either schools or to local authorities in Wales, Scotland and England to identify children as vulnerable as well?
Again, that is a commonality across all 4 jurisdictions, as you say. And I think a really important one, so at the same time as trying to provide some clear guidance, there was flexibility and discretion built in from the outset in each of the sets of guidances available to local authorities and schools.
And then moving on from the identification of vulnerable children, did each part of the United Kingdom broadly implement the same policy around provision of remote learning as well?
Broadly.
Perhaps we'll come to the detail of that shortly. Turning then also to any points of difference, I suppose, is there anything that you would point to that any part of the United Kingdom did that stands out as being quite different from any of the other parts of the UK?
I think there are points of difference that are interesting, but in terms of something really significant and outstanding, probably not on balance.
And just so that we can be clear about this from the start of your evidence, what would you consider to be those interesting points of difference that might be noteworthy?
Yes, so I think we may come to it later, but I think that some parts of the UK were, some of the systems they had in place meant that it was easier for them to move towards remote learning once the pandemic started.
So I think we will come to that quite quickly, actually. But do you mean that in Wales, Scotland and Northern Ireland, that their online provision might have been slightly more advanced than England? Is that the point?
Yeah.
All right. And just coming then broadly to impacts, whether or not overall, and again, just standing back from the detail of your report, whether or not you've concluded that, broadly speaking, the educational impacts of the pandemic have been broadly the same around the United Kingdom, or are there any points of difference that you would point to?
No, again, I think it's an important point to make that actually the impacts were broadly similar.
All right. I'm going to deal then, if I may, and again, just standing back from some of the detail of your report, just to understand your opinion prior to the pandemic as to the standards of education across the United Kingdom. So if I can start, the inquiry's heard evidence from Ofsted, for example, that most schools were judged to be good in England prior to March 2020. Is that picture broadly the same around the United Kingdom?
It's broadly the same. It's probably useful to contextualise that within, within the countries with whom we most often compare ourselves with, rather than just the UK, just to have that broader picture. But So I'm referring to PISA, to
Yes.
the Programme of International Student Assessment, which gives us that broader picture within which we can look at the 4 jurisdictions. Things were broadly good, attendance was broadly stable. Generally, attainment had been improving across the 4 jurisdictions in the previous, say, 15 to 20 years. There was some stagnation, which was causing concern before we went into the pandemic. So things were not perfect, but they were probably imperfect equally across the 4 jurisdictions.
Can I just, before we go on, you've mentioned PISA,
Yeah.
and it's probably important to understand why that might matter in the context of your evidence. PISA is, and please say if I'm wrong, but is that a means of comparing across different countries the attainment levels within each of them in a way that makes them comparable to each other?
Yes, there are 2 things we've done in the report. One is to look at international comparisons, and one is to look at cross-country within the UK comparisons. Simply because sometimes when we might say, for instance, girls outperform boys, which is generally true, it's useful to know whether that is something that only occurs in the UK or whether it's actually part of a global trend. And then we can talk about the differences that may have been affected by the pandemic. So the Programme of International Student Assessment takes place every 3 years, and it looks at reading, writing. It has different emphases, different areas of focus each time that the test is run, but it looks at reading, writing and maths. It has its critics, but the one advantage and the reason that we do refer to it in the report is it's one of the very few tests that all the UK countries are involved in.
Right. So is the importance of it for our part then, it has allowed you in the report to compare the parts of the United Kingdom with each other.
Exactly.
But also to compare how each individual country has done over time in those assessments as well.
Exactly.
All right. You go on in your report to say, recognising that there had been a rise in attainment rates across the United Kingdom, that although this had been noted, there was a concern that it marked variability across the UK. May I ask you about that, please, and what that refers to?
So the first point, just to reiterate, is that there had been some stagnation in the years just before the pandemic. That was a big concern.
Can I just pause and ask you why would that be a cause of concern if the rates were good or regarded as rising?
So if the rates are rising, but the rates of other countries are rising more, then the UK goes down in the rankings, and that is very obviously that's a concern, because the reputation of our education system is then called into question. So if we had some stagnation, so things were plateauing or in some cases just becoming slightly more problematic, then school leaders and governments were concerned about that.
I understand. And had that started to happen then, that concern that the UK was slipping compared to other countries?
Exactly. Yes, it had. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. I'm grateful. Turning then to another point of concern that you mention in your report, you refer on the one hand, I think, in the period leading up to the pandemic, to attainment also increasing in respect of children with special educational needs. Is that correct?
That's right, yes.
But later in your report, when you come to focus specifically on the SEND system, you also refer to there being a crisis in the SEND system as well. It's paragraph 383 if you need it, if that's not on the tip of your tongue. But if you are able to, can you reconcile those two things?
So the first thing to say is I'd prefer, when I'm talking, I will use the phrase special needs, because I want to make sure that we're talking not just about England, but about those four
Yes.
countries. And the term special needs is imperfect in many ways. I would understand that people might have concerns about that particular phrase, but I'm seeking a phrase that doesn't belong to one of the four jurisdictions. So if you'll forgive me for going with something imperfect, that's my reasoning. So yes, it's fair to say that there was a huge amount of legitimate policy attention and increased resourcing over time going towards understanding special needs and addressing the needs of children with special needs. That was making a difference, and overall, the headline was that attainment for children with special needs was improving. However, this was not true for all children with special needs, and it's fair to say that as the depth of knowledge we have of special needs has increased over time, particularly in the last 10 years, which is something we should celebrate, because the more we understand, hopefully the better we're able to support children who face these challenges. But that understanding means that some might say the categories of special need have expanded, and the needs have grown in and of themselves. So we have a situation where the headline looks as though things were improving, but that is certainly not the case for all. And if we look slightly beneath that headline, then we begin to understand how that varied so much for different groups of children and young people in school.
All right. And then, will you forgive me, I should have clarified that at the start, because it's right, isn't it, that special needs are defined differently in each part of the United Kingdom, and the terminology is slightly different in each. Yes. But if we say special needs, that will cover...
It's good enough if we can be forgiven for just going with a phrase that's not ideal, but yeah.
All right. And then lastly, the disadvantage gap before the pandemic as well. Again, can you just provide your opinion as to what progress had been made and where that stood prior to the pandemic?
I think when I've been concerned about stagnation, I think that's really where my concern comes into focus. So there had been concerted attempts to try to address the disadvantage gap. That is, the gap between the children who live in the poorest households and how they attained, and the difference between the achievements of children in more affluent households. And that had really stalled. So it had been a clear focus, again, a clear focus of policy attention in the four jurisdictions of the UK, and again, resources, support, additional teaching, additional classroom support in terms of teaching assistants. So in very practical terms, more money, more people to help, but the disadvantage gap seems to have been really resistant to change.
All right. I'm going to move on then, if I may, to ask you about the matter that you touched upon at the outset of your evidence, which is this different provision that existed across the United Kingdom in terms of access to technology. So if I can just ask you about this, what you have suggested in your report is that in Wales, Scotland and Northern Ireland, that their provision, I'm putting this in broad terms, but that their provision had advanced prior to the pandemic in a way that was different from England. Is that, broadly speaking, correct?
Yes.
And I should say within schools, sorry.
Yes. So there are two aspects to that, I think. The first is that each of Northern Ireland, Scotland and Wales had a digital strategy for education. And it also had a learning platform, which I can say more about in a minute. But if I can just talk about the strategy, there had been a strategy in England, but partly, as far as I understand it, through austerity measures, the digital strategy had been deprioritised and had only recently been resurrected in 2018-2019. And one of the central planks of that was to introduce the idea of demonstrator schools for education technology in England, but it actually hadn't been put into practice before, although the intention was there, the pandemic actually overtook that intention. So you have a difference in strategy prioritisation. It's fair to say, I think, that certainly in the other three jurisdictions, the concerns about rurality and distance and geography probably played its part in the development of those national strategies, and a recognition of a need for it had been around for quite a long time because of the concerns about people missing out because they weren't living in highly populated areas. That wasn't the only driver, for sure. There were other drivers, but that was probably part of it. So you had that strategy, and then also the learning platforms.
Can I just maybe use Scotland as an example then as to how this worked prior to the pandemic? So in terms of the sort of learning platform that was available in Scotland, could you just explain what that actually looked like or what it was? Yeah.
So it's called GLOW, and it was in place long before COVID. And what it is just a central point where schools, teachers and children, which is the really important thing, could all access a central way of sharing information. Children, perhaps if you haven't worked with for people who haven't worked with the learning platform, I think of it a bit like what we do now very automatically with Teams, for instance. So there's it's very easy to share information, to share for teachers to share information about expectations about a piece of work. There's a library of resources. There's ways in which children can send back work for marking. There's lots of opportunities and ways to share feedback, both from children to the adults. It's a way for parents to share information and be informed about what's happening in school. So this system was already in place. I think that's the thing to emphasise. So there were lots of ways in which people would just expect that to be the way that information was shared.
All right. And sorry, forgive me if I hadn't understood. Was it a platform by which online teaching could be provided as well?
Live online teaching was really rare. That was not happening. And not all learning platforms had that facility at that time, to be fair. Perhaps one of the things that Scotland also had was a thing called eSchool, which was live online and was set up in the Western Isles, so one of the most remote parts, and originally, I think, in 2016. Pardon me. It had expanded already by the time the pandemic came along to respond to a broader set of needs. So although it started out very much about live-on learning, partly to do with remoteness and rurality, but also to do with teacher shortages in those areas, so trying to provide teaching online where it would be impossible, say, to have a teacher for a 16-year-old who was looking for a more unusual subject at that level, if that makes sense. But it had developed quite a lot since then. So eSchool also would have a bank of recorded lessons. It also would offer study support for senior pupils looking to work on their national qualifications as well.
And again, was that provision, had that been rolled out across Scotland, or was that for those parts of Scotland that were very remote that would be used?
It was expanding, but it wasn't in place across the whole country.
And I'm going to come back and ask you what the implications of that were in terms of the pandemic, but in terms of Northern Ireland and Wales, was there was their online provision, or the platforms that they were using, were they similar to the ones available in Scotland, or?
I do know most about the Scottish
Yes.
situation, but my understanding is that both Northern Ireland and Wales had learning platforms. It's also fair to say that Northern Ireland actually were early adopters of technology and had probably the most advanced approaches to technology as they went into the pandemic.
I think one of the things that you point to in your report, though, is that prior to the pandemic, there was actually a contraction in the use of technology.
Yes.
And I have two questions about that. I
Yeah.
think the first one is understanding, notwithstanding what you've said about the availability of these platforms in other parts of the UK, whether that contraction applies throughout the UK.
Yes, it does. It, overall, associated with austerity measures, access to technology had actually declined before the pandemic, but its use had actually increased. So although there was less access, what there was being used more actively, but particularly by teachers, not by children themselves. So it's worth noting that as well.
Yes, because we'll come to the other
Yeah.
side of this, which is
Yeah.
about, do children have access to devices
Yes.
to use this?
Yeah.
But just staying on this issue for a second, you also go on to say in your report that there was more digital provision in private schools. Is that correct?
Yes. It seems as though, although the research on this is quite limited, but it looks as though there was more provision. There was 3 times from one report that we do have suggests there was 3 times as much available finance to support that provision as well. So we have a really unequal situation and a real difference between what was available in state education and in private education generally. There were differences, there were variations, but generally.
All right. Well, maybe we'll come and look at this during the pandemic period. Just moving on then, I suppose, to what's the really critical issue for our purposes in this inquiry is, and I'm jumping ahead a bit, but to understand whether or not the availability of that technology in other parts of the United Kingdom proved to be advantageous to those parts of the United Kingdom. I suppose in other words, did they capitalise on it? Did it have a benefit?
There's no evidence, there's no research undertaken across the 4 countries that provides evidence of whether that worked or not. What it looks like, though, from what we can see, is that the systems, because the systems were already in place and the level of familiarity for staff in the schools was such that they had the skills and they had the knowledge of the systems. I think we can probably say that it gave a starting advantage, but I have to be really clear, nobody's undertaken a study to ask that question properly.
All right, but in the work that you've done and the research that you've undertaken, is there any tangible difference, for example, say in attainment or something that might be measurable that might say, you know, we don't know the exact reasons, but
No.
or even specific to any subject to say that might be explicable by the fact that these jurisdictions have better technology prior to the pandemic?
No, because I'm not sure you'd see it in attainment. What you'd probably have to do is to ask staff. But then staff weren't working across the 4 different jurisdictions. They were, very few of them would have moved jobs at any time during that time, just to make a comparison. So they only have their own experience in their own place. So that's why I'm being cautious about it. You know, I think it must have made a difference, but there's no way we can actually know.
What you do go on to say, though, is that throughout the United Kingdom, it was known that a digital divide existed. Yes.
Yes.
So we're back to this the other side of the coin, which is, did children have access to devices? So is is that correct then? Can we say that for each part of the United Kingdom, that divide was there?
That divide was there, and it, again, you asked me earlier if I may refer to it to the commonalities across the UK, and sadly and concerningly, that absolutely the digital divide was a feature in each of the four jurisdictions, and it really had three aspects to it that I think are important to note. It was access, as you've mentioned, so that's access to devices of different kinds, but it was also skills. So the skills that come with experience, with practice, with having access to devices allows you the experiences to develop the skills. So without access, without skills, inevitably then we also see a digital divide in the outcomes for children when they go to use them. So I think so going into the pandemic, we had a series of concerns about these different aspects of the divide, and I think evidence suggests that those things also then made a big difference once the pandemic struck and children were learning at home.
All right.
Most children were learning at home.
All right. Can I turn then to the outset of the pandemic and what opinion or conclusion you've reached as to how well prepared schools across the UK were to pivot to teaching most children in their homes?
To be brief, they were not prepared at all.
And have you come to any conclusions as to why they weren't prepared or why they weren't ready?
There was no scenario planning for a pandemic of this kind. There was no preparation. There was no training for staff. There was no communication that had happened with parents about what to do in the event of. So that much used word, unprecedented, needn't have meant that there was a lack of preparation, but there was a lack of preparation and training.
All right. Moving on then to consider the different steps that were taken to deal with the scenario that schools were coping with. So, first of all, I think dealing, if we may, with the steps that were taken to provide children with devices. And again, just standing back from your report and seeing if I can encapsulate this. Each part of the United Kingdom and each government did implement a strategy to acquire devices and to provide them to children. Is that correct?
Yes, it is, yes.
And is it also correct to say that those devices across the United Kingdom were delivered to children at quite a late point in the first set of school closures?
Yeah, there was huge variability, which is probably, I should sort of I should start every answer by saying that in a way, but generally there was a really late delivery. It's fair to say that governments tried incredibly hard and made strenuous efforts to try to address the lack of devices, but it was also the lack of internet accessibility. So the devices were delivered late, and the internet accessibility wasn't delivered at the same time in many cases. So without the internet, the device was not always very helpful.
All right, let's maybe unpick a little bit of this, and you may just want to have your statement open in front of you from about paragraph 242. But you explain there that in England that there was a scheme by which devices would be provided, and that by the end of June, the end of June 2020, I think 2.6% of learners had been provided with laptops. Have I got that correct?
Yes.
So, and I think we may hear some evidence about this, but those devices intended for specific groups of children, is that correct?
Yes, for disadvantaged learners there, yeah.
But I think as you go on to explain, falling considerably short at that period of time of the numbers of children who actually needed devices, is that correct?
That is correct, yes.
And similarly, I think you set out that in Northern Ireland, 3,000 laptops were distributed in June 2020, correct?
That's right.
And then some more.
Yes, yeah.
In August.
Yes, although I do make the point there also, without internet access, those
Yes.
3,000 laptops.
And then can you just help me with the position in Scotland and when the devices arrived there? I think you've set out that there was initial 25,000 devices were procured, correct?
Yes.
And do you know when those devices were delivered?
Gradually over the summer and into August 2020. Also remembering that the school holiday falls earlier in Scotland, so August 2020 is when the schools go back.
And I think equally when it comes to Wales, it's right to say that Wales, I think, were slightly ahead of the curve and able to provide devices to 2.7% of learners by the end of May.
Yes.
So if we're just looking at government provision of devices then across the United Kingdom, obviously coming at that later point towards the summer of 2020, is that right?
Yes, yeah.
And I think what you explain then in your report is that there is a continuous provision of devices throughout the autumn and winter 2020, correct?
That's right, yes.
And what have you deduced from the fact that those devices continued to be delivered, and I think throughout the period of the second set of school closures as well?
There was a real mismatch between need and what was able to be provided. Again, I do want to recognise the strenuous efforts that everyone was making to try to do this, but it just simply wasn't adequate. Some schools, in some areas, and in some local authorities, were more successful, and I don't know that I could only speculate. I don't know the reasons for that. We don't have any evidence about it. But in general, things were still happening too slowly. And the fact that they were still delivering, it took them a long time to even harmonise the distribution of laptops and the access to the internet, surely, is really quite a grave concern, considering the commitment to ensure continued learning.
We've heard some evidence from some school leaders about being able to either procure devices locally or using budgets to acquire devices. Was that something that your research demonstrated as well?
Yes, in general terms, it just seemed to be really variable. And that's not good because, every child has the same right. It shouldn't be about where you live or whether you live in an affluent area or whether you live in an affluent authority. I mentioned the City of Westminster there as one example. So it really shouldn't matter. And that variability is a real problem.
So that should be the concern. It's the inconsistency of provision. So some schools, some local authorities may have been able to fill gaps, but others may not. Is that right? And again, just in terms of those who most needed devices, what did your research tell you about where the need was greatest?
Again, I do think that there were attempts to try and ensure that disadvantaged learners had access to remote education through devices and having internet access. We can see that a very large number of devices had been delivered by the following February.
Yes.
Now that's a long time in a child's education when you think about how long they're in school, from the age of 4 to the age of, say, 16, 17, 18. So that's the best part of a year, and we still haven't got full delivery for some disadvantaged learners. So it looks like a big number, but it took a long, long time to happen, and those who were disadvantaged were being how can I say this? As schools moved more effectively to live lessons, we also know that this actually led to a kind of cumulative disadvantage for those who were already disadvantaged, because even where they had devices, they were more likely, learners who were disadvantaged were more likely to have to share those devices at home, or share internet access, or through maybe having smaller spaces to work in at home. It meant that they might be in the same room as a parent who was having to work at home, or another child in the family having to work at home. So the impacts of overcrowding, of a lack of study space, lack of devices, lack of variable interconnectivity, all of these things started to really make more of a difference over time.
All right, I think you've touched on a really important point I was going to come to, but I think, as I understand the point that you're making, there's a distinction between the first set of school closures and the second set of school closures in terms of the type of remote learning that was being provided. Is that correct?
Yes, we certainly saw much more of a move to, as schools got more guidance and more skilled, and staff understood the demands of the digital remote offer, the confidence and skills about doing that increased, and live online lessons became much more common. This was a good thing in many ways, and many teachers will have found it, that they could see engagement more clearly, and they felt that the youngsters themselves felt that it was more engaging, and being engaged is part of motivation, and seeing other people face to face, even if it was online, that was a lot better than being sent a worksheet or a pre-recorded video or a piece of paper with a quiz on it, which was a lot more common at the very beginning.
So I think what you're saying is that, in fact, in the second set of school lockdowns, this more effective provision by way of online lessons had the unintended consequence of, in fact, widening potential barriers to children's ability to access that content.
I think that's exactly what I'm saying, and I know it was an unintended consequence, but I think it's something we really want to be aware of when we're thinking about lessons learned and planning for future.
All right. And again, it comes back to this, as you said, that it was thought that having live or synchronous
Yes.
Teaching is the best or the most effective route, but that requires a child to have access to a device at a specific time.
Yes,
is that correct?
that's it. Yeah.
And that's what may have become more challenging for some people, and potentially if different children were having live online lessons at the same time.
Yeah. Absolutely. And
That
I think
would be a concern.
yes, it became a problem.
All right, I'm going to move on, if I may, just to deal. I'm just going to stay with the first set of school closures for the moment, and just ask you a bit more about variation in what was being provided during the first set of school closures. Can I just ask you then about, I think, the point that you're making, that there was, again, this word variability across the United Kingdom about the types of education that children were being provided with during that period. Is that correct?
There was variability in a number of different ways. So I think that there was variability between what independent private schools were able to offer and what state education was offering. I've mentioned that. So there was a move in commonly in independent schools to more live lessons, and for a closer following of the typical school curriculum as well. They generally found it easier to pivot to online learning and than state schools did. So there was that difference. The other difference, which I think is a really understandable difference, was that the the expectations that you could have of secondary age learners about being able to sit in front of a screen are vastly different from what we might expect for a child of 4 or 5 or 6. And so, of course, there needed to be differences. There needed to be differences in approaches. And so some of the variation was, if you like, pedagogically led. It made sense, and some of it was not. It was about what we might say is a really unfortunate set of circumstances, again, depending on, where you were growing up or the household you were growing up in. So there were different kinds of things going on.
Can I just ask you about the first point that you made about teaching very small, teaching younger children?
Yes.
And I mean, a question really drawing on your expertise about how difficult or not it is to teach younger children online as opposed to teaching them in the classroom.
I think a lot of school staff had real concerns about how they would be able to work with children who, if they were in a classroom, they'd be able to move them on from activities very quickly. They'd be able to take account of the fact that young children developmentally cannot sit still for very long. Their bodies need to move physically. And so, the range of activities, the range of relationship between learning and physical movement is very, very different. The need for play is well understood now. Play as part of development, which feeds into, learning and progress and achievement. So I think that primary school staff had a real challenge on their hands, particularly for younger ages, in trying to work remotely. It isn't reasonable, and it's inappropriate to expect small children to sit in front of a screen.
All right. And just coming back then to the question that we started with, which is just to understand more about the reality of children's lives during the pandemic and the sorts of education that they were provided with. You've mentioned differences in being provided with live online lessons during the first period of school closures. And have you come to an assessment as to putting private schools to one side, how common or not it was for children to have live lessons during that first period of closures?
Yeah, it was really rare. Yeah, it was much less common. It became more common, but in the first lockdown, it was unusual.
And have you been able to come to an overall assessment as to actually what children were doing or what their school day might have looked like during that first period of school closures?
There's quite a lot of data which suggests that there were children were, like staff, children were making really good attempts in general to engage. They were being sent homework, as it was, or what might have been called homework before the pandemic. It looked very traditional. So we're talking about worksheets, workbooks, quizzes, videos that they could look at that would support their learning. There was a move, I think, to be fair, across all 4 jurisdictions again, that because the national exams were being cancelled, a setting aside of that expectation and the pressures of preparing for exams meant that children should concentrate on consolidating their learning and feeling secure in the learning and the things they already knew, so they wouldn't lose traction, but that any new content learning, if you like, would be much more difficult to deliver. So that was not the priority, and there was a big emphasis initially on welfare, on well-being of children, and that consolidation of learning rather than new learning.
And does that apply at both primary and secondary, or was the provision more advanced for secondary school pupils?
I think there was a general messaging about consolidation that ran through primary and secondary. That's not to say there weren't crosswinds and that there weren't expectations that went against that in other ways, but I think if we look at the messaging that was coming through policy, it's very person-centred in many ways, actually.
When you say person-centred, can I just ask what that means?
Sorry,
please?
I mean that it's about trying to understand the holistic needs of a child rather than simply focus on attainment and academic achievement. It's about the well-being aspects of being in isolation.
One of the announcements that was also made on the 18th of March was that secondary school examinations wouldn't take place. That was certainly the position in England. Did that impact that early decision that those exams wouldn't go ahead? Do you know if that impacted then on the specific provision of education to children who would have been expecting to do exams?
It impacted immediately, yes. My understanding is that it impacted in ways that were perhaps unexpected. So you might have expected just that the young people who were preparing for exams would be delighted that they weren't going to have to do the exams. But actually, they had been preparing really hard for those exams in general. It's such a rite of passage for many of our young people in the UK. It's an expectation that society talks about from such an early age as well. So to that move to cancel exams, while absolutely necessary and understandable, actually created a whole tumult, a real sense of disorientation, I think, for that generation of young people who are expecting to sit exams or other qualifications and accreditations. So the provision that was put in place instead, no matter what it was always going to feel really kind of not second best, I'm struggling for words a bit, but just out of kilter with their expectations for such a long time.
Yes. All right. I think, in fact, I wondered whether or not their exams having been cancelled, what sort of teaching they were getting if it wasn't orientated towards exams, and whether or not there was, in fact, substitution for teaching towards that end.
Yeah, I think I've used the word consolidation of known. Of course, good teachers will always try to extend what's available, and that happened. And although I haven't said so in so many words, I'd really like to note how the dedication of staff was just above and beyond in so many ways in which they tried to do to ensure that, particularly if we're just talking about the young people who are expecting to sit exams, and to provide a good education in very difficult circumstances for them. They really went above and beyond, and that included trying to consolidate but also extend, but not introduce new concepts. I think that's the distinction.
That was in terms of variation, that's obviously about types of education being provided. I think your report also points to variation in terms of the number of hours that children were doing schoolwork for during this first period of school closures as well. So again, can I ask you about that and the degree to which there was variation in what children were spending time doing in terms of learning?
It's very straightforward to measure the amount of time that children usually spend in school.
Yes.
So we can say, they spend 5 to 6 hours a day in school, for example, just generally. And, a little sort of note of caution, because we don't know exactly, because there was huge variability, again, in terms of what was being offered and what was being accessed in terms of education in the first lockdown and in the second lockdown, but less so in the second lockdown, but certainly initially. But we know it was far less. So it varied according to age, but in general terms, even when we say older learners were probably approaching closer to 5 to 6 hours a day, it was still less. For younger learners, it was less than that, generally.
I think what you suggest in some of your evidence is that there is some evidence of, for example, average periods of time that children may have spent doing their schoolwork, but underneath that might lie considerable variation. Is that correct?
Yes, it is. Yes, and I wanted to draw attention to the differences in terms of the experiences of children living with disadvantage.
in that regard, can you just explain, sorry, what you mean by that?
So certainly in the first lockdown, children living with disadvantage were much less likely to engage with education. Children with different kinds of vulnerability were less likely to engage with education. And there's probably a number of reasons for that, but I think that difference is the first thing to note.
Thank you. And I think just moving on then, which is a separate point probably from our spent but related, is that question of engagement. So in other words, a child could have a device, but the question of whether or not they're engaging with online learning is a separate question. Is that correct?
Yes, I think it relates to the broader understanding of the things that help engagement, and that's knowledge that we have from research over a long period of time. So we know that engagement is assisted where the school itself has good leadership, so that broader context. We know it matters what kind of family circumstances and what the household circumstances are in which the child is trying to learn. We know that the neighbourhood matters, and we know individual factors also really matter for learning. We do know that the challenges for children living with disadvantage, and I've talked about some of them already, were just so much greater. We know that overcrowding, for instance, or not having a study space was generally, before the pandemic, was already a compounding disadvantage for children who struggle in school. But when the pandemic came, obviously the issues of home study spaces just become so much more central, and probably compounds disadvantage even further.
In your report at paragraph 198, you refer to a survey that was carried out by the Educational Institute of Scotland that reported that low learner engagement was the most significant barrier to delivering remote learning.
Yeah.
And that we also see that the Office for National Statistics in England in 2020 also reported that, we can see there, over half of parents surveyed said that their children were struggling with remote learning at home for reasons including lack of motivation and lack of guidance and support. Is that correct? Yes,
it is. I mean, it is still worth remembering that digital access was a real problem, and digital skills associated with lack of access were still a problem. So these words, motivation and engagement, are a little bit, could be misinterpreted. I think that behind that, what might look like a lack of motivation is probably a lot of the things that I've already mentioned about the actual circumstances within which children were trying to learn. And clearly, if you were in a home where there were easy access to devices, where everybody in the household had their own devices, where the internet speeds were good, then that helps. And where those things are missing, that means there's a hindrance or a barrier. It is quite clear that also the lack of guidance and support needs to be understood a bit more carefully as well. So children with living with disadvantage were often the children of people who were either on, who may have been key workers, so they may not have had the capacity to spend a lot of time assisting their children. On the other hand, we also know that parents from low-income families spent a lot of time trying to help their children. So it may just be the kind of support and guidance wasn't as effective for some children, even though their parents were willing and indeed very committed to offering the support that they could.
I think what you suggest at paragraph 198, and also you pick it up at paragraph 200 as well, is that the potential lack of engagement is also demonstrated on the teacher side of the equation as well. Is that right? So teachers were reporting that they weren't getting work back from children as well. Is that right?
Yes, the teachers were really concerned about this. So I think that teachers were really were aware of the difficulties some children were facing. And the statistics there, so around a quarter, 24%, saying fewer than 1 in 4 children in the class are returning work that have been set. That's quite a statistic. That is quite a concerning amount. It is in the early days. It is 2020. It is the first lockdown. But it's still quite a concern.
All right. One of the things that you point to in your report that was an issue was that in some schools, in fact, they were required to have cameras off. Is that right?
Yes. Across the UK, I think it's fair to say that concerns about safeguarding and privacy meant that having cameras off, it became quite an issue. And I think that it probably, although there might have been good reasons for it, we also know it really affects engagement. I mean, we know that as adults, if the camera's off, it does give us the opportunity to do other things, or it's easier to drift. The concentration isn't as good. So, yes.
I mean, that seems like a really obvious point. It's quite hard to understand why that would have carried on, given that it's the idea that children would engage with cameras off. It's difficult to conceive why they would.
I think they were just, as I say, the UK schools have a real concern about safeguarding and privacy in general. Again, for good reasons. I think that there was, an understanding that children may be in shared spaces online. That wasn't. Shared spaces as in the physical space they were in when they were online. There might be other people in the background. There might be other children in the background. There might be all sorts of things going on, and that would detract from the feelings of safety, and that it just wasn't appropriate in many cases. There were real differences in how this was understood across different schools, but that was the general message.
Right. Yeah. Can I then just touch on a different subject, please, which is the particular difficulties that children with special needs faced in accessing online education? Can you just explain, please, in summary form, what the particular barriers were that some of those children faced?
Yeah. So it's worth saying, first of all, that the vast majority of children with special needs are in our mainstream schools. So while it's important to think about what happened in more specialist education settings, most children with special needs are in mainstream schools, generally. So when the pandemic started, the complexities around vulnerability and how it was being defined had a real and immediate impact on the children with special needs right away. So, am I eligible to go to school or not? And there were lots of reasons for and against children being able to go to school when they had special needs. The range of special needs makes it really difficult to talk about one answer for all children.
Yes.
I think it's really invidious to kind of do that, because it oversimplifies the situation that is just not the case. So we've got to be really careful.
So just in terms of understanding entirely why you say that, but there has been evidence to the inquiry, for example, that children with certain needs might need different types of remote technology to help them to be able to learn at home, and, for example, that there were barriers about being able to access that. Yeah. Is that it? I mean, did your research demonstrate those sorts of barriers?
Absolutely. So there's barriers. So although I've said and want to emphasise that most children with special needs are in mainstream schools, they are often there with additional support from staff, for a start, who are able to provide, for instance, one-to-one support or one-to-two support, who can help them with physical needs if that's appropriate, or with accessing materials more easily, or resources more easily. And so the first thing is that person resource is no longer there. Whether that's an additional teacher or teaching assistant, pupil support assistant, personal assistant, all that range of that workforce that is so vital in our schools. And then secondly, as I think perhaps you were hinting at there, there's also the question about, adaptive technologies and systems that support them in learning in schools. So if we take an example perhaps of children who are deaf or children who are visually impaired, the significant difficulties that they face in not having the technology available for them at home, it increases the barriers to learning so much. It's really difficult really problematic for children and their families.
And finally, just this on this topic, your overall conclusion at paragraph 366 is that mitigation by remote learning failed overall during the pandemic. I wanted to see if I could unpick that a little bit. Are you saying it failed by way of mitigation because it wasn't an adequate substitute for face-to-face learning, or are you assessing that on a different basis?
The former. So I think that there was no better alternative. So I think it's really important to say that. I think that the efforts that were made in good faith, and a huge amount was done to try to mitigate the difficulties that children faced, but it was not an adequate response, and I think that was because of the lack of planning in advance and preparedness. And resource, the financial resource, which is a point I make a number of times in the report. So the preparation wasn't there, the training wasn't there, but people did the very best they could in the circumstances. But it wasn't adequate. At the end of the day, it was not adequate.
And does that observation also go for the second set of school closures as well, from January 2021 onwards?
I think a lot more was done. We know that a lot more was provided by the second lockdown and the second set of closures, and then into 2021. But I think that, was it as good as being in school? No. Were the mitigations put in place equal to the offering that school made? No.
Thank you. I think that may be an appropriate moment. I've slightly lost track of time, my lady, but I think that we're due a break in and around now, if that's a... Oh.
Oh.
You're on mute.
Sorry. If we, yeah, that's absolutely fine. If we break now, I was just doing calculations, shows I wouldn't pass any maths test. 25 past, I'll return.
I'm grateful.
Stubborn.
My lady. Professor, I want to move on then, if I may, to the second mitigation that was used across the United Kingdom during the periods of school closure, which was to permit vulnerable children to attend school. You've already said broadly the same policy applied across the United Kingdom, is that correct?
It is.
And broadly the same area of discretion afforded to schools and local authorities to determine whether or not a child was vulnerable, yes?
Yes.
And again, if I just ask you for your overall assessment as to the success of that policy during the first period of school closures.
I think it's important to say that the policy was in itself seemed a good one. I think it made genuine attempts to try to include as many aspects of vulnerability as possible, but its operation failed.
And why do you say it failed?
Because we know that the percentage of children who were vulnerable, who attended school, who were eligible and who attended school was really low.
All right, can we look at that, please? And could we please go to page 62 of the witness statement and to the table, table 8.
Yes.
And if we could enlarge that, please. So I think, first of all, and we'll come to this point, Professor, if we look at the first part of the table, that's the share of institutions open, correct?
Yes.
So this shows what proportion of schools were open in different parts of the United Kingdom. And we can see that in England it was a much higher proportion, correct?
Yes.
And is that a reflection of the fact in Wales, Scotland and Northern Ireland they had a hub system rather than individual schools being open?
That's right. So the hub or cluster school system was intended to ensure that there was a central point where resources would be provided, and that children who were either vulnerable or the children of key workers could attend local schools, and that was the case for Wales, Scotland and Northern Ireland. So it's difficult to make comparisons between the two systems.
Yes.
They were quite different systems.
All right. And does that caution attach to this table in general? It shouldn't be used as a point of comparison.
That's right. And if we look at the key notes, some of that need for caution about comparison would also play out in terms of who's included in the vulnerable category
Yes,
as well.
I'm going to look at that just to understand that, because I think you make a point about the need for care around that. But if we just look at the second part of the table, to the share of pupils attending,
Yes.
and look at the average during lockdown, I think it's correct that across all parts of the United Kingdom, the overall proportion of children in schools was very small. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And particularly small in Northern Ireland.
Yes, that's also right.
All right. So that's the share of all pupils attending. The third part of the table assesses the share of vulnerable pupils attending. Is that correct?
It's yes, but it is a proportion of the vulnerable pupils.
Yes, that's what I wanted to ask you.
Okay.
Sorry, can you just explain that then? So if we look at England and we see
Yes.
April 2020, 5%, and we see that increasing throughout May and June, can you just explain what that percentage relates to?
So the definition of vulnerable pupils, which is also given in the report in
Yes.
earlier table 7, shows that the vulnerable included a range of different needs. However, the keynotes here show that this measure of vulnerability refers to pupils with an education, health or care plan or have a social worker. So that's a narrower definition of vulnerability.
Yes. So I think if we look at the policy in England, which includes that discretion to include a child who the school or the local authority deems vulnerable,
Yeah.
it's that broader cohort of children that don't appear
Yes.
in this table.
That's right, and that is the case. Although there are different categorisations and different ways of measuring vulnerability, each of the 4 jurisdictions in this table show a narrower definition of vulnerability. So I suppose the reason I'm making that point is to emphasise that although these percentages are already really low, they're actually probably not indicating the full extent of that really low number. It was even worse, is what I'm
Yes.
trying to say.
And I think, so if I'm just taking England because it's an easy example to take, if a school can deem someone vulnerable, that will bring into play presumably lots of information that the school knows about the child that will make them think that they're vulnerable.
Yeah,
But it doesn't lend itself to a definition, does it?
yeah,
I hope that makes sense. That's a
Yes.
school's judgment about
Yeah.
who's vulnerable.
yeah.
So presumably then it would be very difficult to say or to estimate the overall proportion of vulnerable children that there might be in any given school or in the school population in a particular part of the United Kingdom.
The term vulnerable had a generalised layperson's type use in education prior to pandemic. It took on new meanings and a new definition in the pandemic. So you wouldn't expect schools to have been using the word vulnerable as a way of defining children across the UK prior to the pandemic. So to be fair to the schools, that wasn't the way they looked at things prior to the pandemic. It wasn't to say they wouldn't use the word vulnerable. It wasn't to say they weren't aware of vulnerability, but it wasn't a tool in the same way as it became. Yeah.
All right. But is the main message then to take away from this that having regard to those percentages, they are, in your opinion, an underestimate of the actual number of vulnerable children who were not attending school?
Even if they're correct, they're very, very low and concerningly low. I think there is evidence to suggest they're probably an overestimate. So at the very best, they're very low and concerning.
Right. We can see when it comes to England that percentage increased in the June period of 2020. Is that correct?
Yes.
And do you have an understanding as to why that number went up in June 2020, or what might explain that?
There's a number of possible reasons, but certainly clarity, schools themselves having greater clarity on vulnerability and categorisation and eligibility, that was improving. I think, you know, as with all the circumstances in the April, things were just really, really muddied, really confusing, and you had parents not understanding what was going on. You had children unsure, and you had schools themselves. So some of that was about increasing clarity. We can see that the percentages increased across all 4 jurisdictions in that time.
But we can also say, I think that, and I'm conscious of your warning to be careful about comparison, but does this help us understand that even with that caution that there were fewer vulnerable children, even on a narrow definition, attending schools in the other part of the United Kingdom?
Yes. Yeah.
And what's your opinion as to what that reason, why they were attending in lower numbers?
I think that, again, there's a number of reasons, and it's really a case of collating those reasons from a number of different studies rather than from one source. So we know, for example, that there was confusion and lack of clarity. Despite attempts to be clear, there was confusion. So some of that intended discretion and flexibility probably inadvertently gave rise to some of that confusion. We also know that there was a fear of risk of infection for children who had some kind of vulnerability. We also know that there was also the stigma for some children of not wanting to be identified, particularly older learners, and adolescents not wanting to have anything that makes them stand out in any way would be a common thing regardless of the pandemic. The stigma of being identified as vulnerable, I think, was also an understandable reason that made it probably added to the complications. But as well as that, if vulnerable pupils included pupils for whom perhaps specific arrangements would have needed to be in school and it was difficult to provide them, then, you know, even though they were eligible, their, you know, the staff and resourcing might not have been in place. Obviously, staff and resources were affected by COVID as well. School staff were affected. They were getting COVID as well. So it was really difficult to maintain a stable staff base. And then also things like, as we've said earlier, the provision of resources, as well as the human resource, the physical resources that would enable the child to feel safe coming into school and to know that the familiar routines, the familiar provisions, for instance, devices that they might need, would not necessarily be there in the same way. So there were transport would be another aspect. Some of the children who would be vulnerable would have individualised transport arrangements for school. Again, they were disrupted for understandable reasons during COVID. So there was a real combination of reasons.
And does this data also suggest that the hub system was less effective than getting children into school?
Yes, I think that probably does add to it. I mean, children I think there's a natural reluctance to go to a place that you don't know, an unfamiliar place, especially when so much else was in turmoil. And I think that some of that fear, the generalised fear, was also about, oh, and now I've got to go to somewhere I don't know. And I'm going to meet with children I don't know. They're not my classmates. They're not my peers. And at a time of increased anxiety and turbulence anyway, that probably added to it. Some of the evidence certainly suggests that those feelings of uncertainty and anxiety stood in the way of going to the hub schools.
You've said at paragraph 133, the key message to take from these figures is that take-up was very low across the UK, and although attendance increased in later lockdowns, it remained concerningly low. Is that correct?
Yes.
And in that same paragraph, you also set out, I think, a critique of the use of the term vulnerable itself in the context of this policy. Can I ask you that? Is it your opinion that framing the ability of children to attend in vulnerability was a mistake on the parts of the governments of the United Kingdom?
I think it was a genuine attempt to assist schools to understand their duties, and it was probably sensible to try and emphasise that school attendance offered safety and surety, and that some children were more at risk without that. And I can understand why the word vulnerable seemed a helpful term. However, again, perhaps inadvertently, it just didn't work in the ways intended. And the fact that the definitions of vulnerability not only had a discretion built in, which is a good thing, but that they changed over time. The categories of vulnerability expanded, I think, was really unhelpful. I understand why it happened, and I'm sure that school staff would often be appreciate that would be helpful in principle, but in practice it just added to the general confusion and uncertainty that families were feeling, and indeed school staff themselves, about knowing what was coming next. So the rapid changes and the kinds of changes around those definitions.
I think the point that would be made against that is if you don't specify certain children as being eligible to come into school, for example, that acts as a disincentive, whereas if you've actually said these specific groups of children fall within the category, that does give the sort of certainty that perhaps you've suggested is lacking. So
yeah. Yes, I think that if so in terms of for next time, I think we need to think really carefully about whether that vulnerability category can include all those things. But because we had schools that were not used to using that terminology, they already had systems that talked about SEND or additional learning needs or special educational needs, and about additional support needs, those being the 4 ways in which it was categorised across the UK. And then now they have this new category which attempts to include both disadvantage and special needs broadly defined. And that just gave rise to too many problems. With planning, that can be avoided. And I think that with training and with understanding, with discussion about how to use it, I don't think there would necessarily be a problem. But in these circumstances, with the lack of planning and preparation for the use of the term, it did give rise to problems. So I think it's avoidable, but that did cause problems in this really difficult set of circumstances.
So just to understand that again in terms of looking towards the future, that greater clarity and greater certainty at the start of a pandemic as to precisely which children will fall within the definition is what would be helpful.
The danger with categorisation is you always miss somebody out.
Yes.
So I think that there always needs to be some discretion and flexibility. But I think that the more preparation that goes into understanding where flexibility might be needed or discretion might be needed, I think would help national governments, local authorities and schools just understand that so much better.
Thank you. You have also set out in your report, and I'm just picking this up, when it comes to, to children who were entitled to attend special schools,
Yeah.
and it's at paragraph 403 in England, you've set out some findings there that, again, there were specific reasons that may have made attendance at those schools more difficult. Is that correct?
Yes, yeah.
And those sorts of reasons being, for example, the risk assessment that was carried out by the school. Is that right?
It is. I think that there was a criticism, seemed to me a legitimate criticism from many of the head teachers of such schools, that much of the guidance was directed towards typical mainstream schools, and often specialist schools, the clues in the term, so they have perhaps a variation on the ways in which they need to think about children's safety and about school safety and school staff support. So I think that some schools were forced into a situation where they were making very localised risk assessments and local specific decisions for their school. Understandable, but actually really quite difficult. And I think that sometimes they said themselves it made for some quite difficult decisions they didn't want to be making, and situations they were not comfortable about.
And I think the point that you make at paragraph 397 is that in terms of England, those children who had education, health and care plans, that they represented only a small proportion of the children who were attending school during the first lockdown.
Yes,
is that correct?
yes.
And again, was that picture reflected across the United Kingdom?
In broad terms, yes. Yeah, the systems are different, but the general principle of children with a higher level of needs, which was recognised and noted in some way officially.
Yes,
that's certainly the case. Yes.
And just then standing back, if I may, Professor, and where this leaves things at the end of the pandemic. Can I first ask you about those categories of children who you think were particularly impacted by this combination of school closures and the effectiveness or not of the mitigations that were put in place? So can I start maybe with those children who have special needs and your opinion as to whether or not they were particularly impacted?
Yes, they, as a group, as a whole, they were... their progress was disrupted in ways that were more detrimental than for the general. So the general population was impacted negatively, but children with special needs were impacted more.
And may I ask you just on that, the fact that those children were attending school in smaller numbers, did that mean that they weren't getting access to other forms of services or therapies that they might otherwise have been accessing?
Yes, because many of those services are provided via the school. And that was one of the concerns that the specialist settings and mainstream schools that supported children with special needs, they were really conscious of that the access to health and therapy services, which were often accessed through the schools, that was made so much more problematic. And it was problematic for those who already had been identified as having needs, but for those children who were maybe coming to the front of the queue for identification, for assessment of risk, for assessment of needs and diagnoses, that was even harder. So it was hard for those who were already identified and had the needs, but it was really noticeable that children who were had not yet had a diagnosis or an assessment, that largely stopped. Yeah.
All right. And then I wanted to ask you about children who were going through periods of transition in their education as well, and what your opinion was as to whether those children were particularly impacted by the pandemic period.
Yes, I mean, we talk about sort of key transition points, obviously starting primary school, transferring from primary school to secondary school, and then onward from secondary school to whatever's ahead, whether that's into work or into some kind of training, to further education or higher education. Probably all of those points of transition. They're seen as critical points of transition in terms of developmental
Yes.
needs. And each of those was seen to be disrupted. There's evidence that suggests that each of those points was disrupted. And just even if we take the primary to secondary transition, the number of, preparation programs, induction programs, the familiarity that grows with visiting the new school, with meeting the new teachers, the experiencing the fact that there's going to be a much greater range of teachers you're going to have rather than your one class teacher you've had for a whole year. All of those things are now no longer available in the way they were. And the saying goodbye to people, those are really important rituals that we expect to go through at these points of transition. All of these things are disrupted for all of these children, and I think with quite profound impacts. Again, for all, but more particularly for those who were perhaps least secure in their learning or least secure in their friendships, whose well-being was not as deeply rooted and as strong.
And in terms then of those children who may have been coming to the later key transition points, so maybe the children who were doing their exams at 16 or at 18, what's your opinion in terms of the impact on those children?
I've said earlier the evidence is strong that they felt really that they actually were, they felt the rug had been pulled from under their feet in terms of the exams, which, I know young people always moan about having to do their exams, but it's a rite of passage. It's an expectation in our society. And for something that big to change, that was a really important challenge and something to note. It was also the case that young people at that point of transition on from school were really concerned about career plans. We know that many of them changed career plans, changed plans for their education as well. And also for young people who would be more likely to move on to work directly with people. That was difficult. And for example, so many young people work in hospitality and retail as a first step, or maybe, a longer term commitment, a career that they would want to pursue. These things were also really difficult. So both the practical and emotional things were affected quite deeply and quite in wide-ranging ways.
All right, and I wanted to ask you then some about your opinion. I think you've now had a chance to read the expert report in respect of long COVID, is that correct?
Yes.
And also I think that your attention has been drawn to some of the research that has been done as well. One of the studies in particular, perhaps if we bring that up, that's INQ 000 593477. Thank you. And if perhaps we can see that this is a report, I think, Professor, thank you, that was carried, it's a piece of research that was carried out, I think it's by, or in respect of 22 young people, and also the caregivers, that's right. 15 parents and caregivers of children who were aged 5 to 18, is that correct?
Yes, yeah.
And I had really just wanted to ask you about a point that emerges having regard to both the long COVID expert report and this report. And if we could just go ahead, please, to page 5 of this report. And I think it's helpfully encapsulated under the section that says discussion. And we can see that it sets out our findings, highlight the importance of school to children and young people with long COVID, and how returning to school was central to their much hoped for return to normal. And I think the report, I won't ask you to go through all of it, but talks about some of the challenges that children had in being able to return to school. Thank you, that can come down. That report obviously helps to understand on the part of children who had long COVID, that desire on their part to be able to go back to school. Is that as you read it?
Yes, and I
to be
think
able to participate in school.
Yeah, and I think that a point I've made, sort of perhaps a bit tongue in cheek, is so far that although young people, particularly adolescents, rebel against school and find it difficult, but actually they still really value school, and in a very important sense, children with long COVID are exactly the same as any other child. They want to go to school. A key finding of this report, and it is a small qualitative report, so I know we will treat that with caution. It's a small number, it's a small sample size, but at the same time, it mirrors findings of many, many other studies, in that these are young people who are very ordinary, actually, in their desire to attend school and to be part of the school experience, and they value it.
And does this then require consideration of specific strategies then to help children who have conditions like COVID to be able to participate in school in a way that is, I suppose, in a way that recognises that they may have some of the challenges that this report discusses, like feeling exhausted or feeling as though, maybe after doing one lesson they need a break or rest or...
Yeah. Yes, absolutely. I think that that is a really fair request, and that I think that there is a growing understanding of the need for that kind of flexibility, and that there are strategies that schools could and should put in place to try and support children who face those challenges.
I want to then just deal with another group of children, which is those children who come from clinically vulnerable or clinically extremely vulnerable families. Yeah. And I think that you have highlighted again in your report the fact that there's a lack of research about children in these families, or children, I should say as well, who are clinically vulnerable themselves. I think you have that from paragraph 328 and 339. I think one of the documents that was put in your bundle was one of the NFER studies that highlighted that there was a considerable number of children who lived with a family member who was clinically vulnerable. And also that many of those children were in families that came from specific ethnic backgrounds as well. Again, can I just ask you then about that and how much is known from an educational perspective about the barriers that those children might face in being able to attend school?
Yes, I think this puzzled me a fair bit, because there seemed to be a difference between what was happening in England in terms of the tenor of policy guidance and what was happening elsewhere in the UK. There did seem to be a narrower expectation, an expectation that all children should return to school as far as possible, and perhaps less in England, and less of a recognition that clinical vulnerability would be absolutely understandable concern. And when I looked at the guidance that was available in the other three jurisdictions, it seemed to offer much more of we need to take each case as it happens. One of the differences, for instance, is that only England was continuing with, was talking about penalties and fines and that punitive approach. I think that's probably the difference. It felt as though England, in this particular point, was emphasising a strict and punitive approach, whereas the other three weren't. They were talking about the need for understanding, support, flexibility. That it wasn't always mentioning specifically clinical vulnerability, and I did look for that. And in fact, it probably should. So although some things were mentioned in terms of needing that flexibility, not each of the countries, this is one of my things about we need consistency across the four countries in future. It would be helpful to name that much more clearly. So to go back to your earlier question about, vulnerability being defined more clearly, it seems to me that there's really good grounds for saying that clinical vulnerability should be explicitly mentioned, and that it should be explicitly mentioned in connection with a supportive and proactively supportive approach on the part of schools, whether that's for the child or for the family and environment within which they're living.
Right. I'm going to move away then, if I may, just from focusing on some of the groups of children who you've given evidence about, to just, again, and this is standing back from the detail of your report, to understand some of the persisting consequences of the pandemic. And I think the first one of those is attendance. And so may I just ask you this then, is it correct that persistent attendance post-pandemic is problematic across the United Kingdom?
That's right.
And are you able to offer an opinion as to the relationship between the pandemic and persistent absenteeism, and why it has crystallised into a more persistent problem since the end of the pandemic?
I think that in research terms, it's still relatively early days to be saying we can feel confident about all the reasons and make sure we have a really good understanding of what's going on. So if I can just make it clear, some of this is quite tentative, just in terms of the timelines. We're only 2 years out of that. It's difficult to do comparisons. That said, it is clear that those patterns of attendance tell us something about what's happening. So it's not that all children have lower levels of attendance than they did before. It's the patterns within that we can see that are concerning. And that is that children living with disadvantage, once again, have lower attendance rates and have an increasing rate of what we might call the persistent non-attendance. We can also see that children with special needs, their rates of attendance have not recovered to the same level as their peers. So not only are the levels of attendance lower, it's the patterns within that might concern us. When we start to think about what the reasons for that, again, it's drawing on different data from different places, but it certainly seems the case that the continuing and cumulative impacts of the under-resourcing of schools, which was happening before the pandemic, plus the pandemic on top of that, has made a difference to how engaged children can be when they're in school. And I've earlier suggested we need to be cautious not to assign blame and make it that the child should be more engaged. It is a two-way street. It's a process. It's a relationship between the school and the child. But we can see that engagement and attendance are lower for these groups. So it certainly seems to be related to both what was happening before, in terms of we know that there was already a slight decline in attendance before the pandemic for these groups, particularly for older learners,
yes.
Age 14 onwards. And if we took the huge bump that we got from the pandemic out of it, some of that suggests this pattern actually just follows on from the pattern we were seeing beforehand, which is concerning.
And then if I can ask you about the disadvantage gap and your opinion as to the impact that the pandemic has had on that, please.
Yes, so it seems that for children living in more affluent and advantaged circumstances, their recovery has been stronger, particularly in England. Overall, there are still some declines and decreases in, if you like, the core subjects: reading, writing, maths, science, in Scotland, in Northern Ireland, Scotland and Wales. But in England, there seems to have been a stronger recovery overall in terms of attainment. That is not the case for children living with disadvantage. what seems to be happening is that the gap in some places is widening, not overall, but as a general picture, it's still widening, and we have not gone back to pre-pandemic levels, and pre-pandemic levels were not good.
Yes. All right. If I can move on then to your overall conclusion that you've reached, and this is at paragraph 466 of your statement, where you've said the consensus, where you talk about and you, I think, conclude that there's a consensus that school closures triggered by the pandemic have had a severely detrimental effect on learning and attainment. Is that correct?
Yes.
Is that your overall assessment of each of the parts of the United Kingdom as a consequence of the pandemic?
I think from what we can tell at the moment, at this point, still early days, I feel confident that that's a fair assessment.
Can I ask you a bit about the most recent data that's come from the Department for Education? And if we could go to this, please, at INQ 000 587 992. Thank you. And if we could go, please, to page 36. I think, Professor, that you've been provided with this, haven't you?
Yes.
In order that you can take it into account, and so that we can ask whether or not your overall opinion that you've just stated is in any way changed by the most up-to-date data that's available for England.
Yep.
I'll come and ask you whether or not you think this might be mirrored in other parts of the United Kingdom.
So sorry, apologies.
No, I was going to say this looks quite technical to people who are not educationalists, but I think this is setting out in each of those subjects at Key Stage 2 the children that are meeting the expected standard. And I think that the point is, if one looks at the most recent data, that might look broadly, there are some percentage points difference, but that might look broadly in keeping, for example, with 2018 to 2019.
Yes.
May I ask you about that and what you think that data might throw light on?
When I look at the data, if we look at the readings, it was, if we take the ones that are helpfully highlighted, it was 73%, but it's actually a percentage point higher in the most recent statistics, 23-24. Teacher assessed, TA, teacher assessed writing, 78% in 2018 to 19, but down slightly, 72% in the most recent data. If we look at the maths, it was 79% in 2018-19, but down to 73% in the most recent data. And if we look at science, again, teacher assessed, it's slightly down as well. So one up and the rest down. But, you know, these are one of the points I've been, this is good news. If actually considering everything, I would see this as fairly positive. And something that tentatively we might be able to celebrate. It looks like good news, even the ones that have gone down. If considering all that's happened, I think that may not be a bad outcome overall. Again, though, my note of caution is always the headline data masks a lot of variability, and it isn't until we look at later tables in the same document, for example, that we see some of the issues for children facing disadvantage or with special needs.
All right. And if I can just then go, please, to table 12, which is on page 39. I think, as I understand it, this is the disadvantage gap index. Is that correct?
Yes.
And again, can I just ask you, without going into the technical detail of this table, what it tells the inquiry?
So the disadvantage gaps, if we have the closer you get to looking at that bottom, the disadvantage gap index, the closer you get to 0 there means the gap is at its narrowest. So if we have 3.03 in 2015-16, for example, and then just before the pandemic we have 2.91, so it's decreasing slightly as a headline. And then when we come to 23-24, it's increasing again.
So we see a continuum if we just keep our, if we just stay with that line from 3.23 in 21 to 22,
Yeah.
3.21 and then 3.13. Is that correct?
Yes. Yeah.
And again, can I just ask whether or not that figure for 23-24, whether or not that is a cause for optimism in relation to this?
I'm not as confident about that at all. I'm not too sure. I mean, it looks to me as though, yes, we might say the gap has decreased slightly since 21-22 or since 22-23, but I think it's just too soon to talk about a long-term pattern with that.
Right.
It might be something to argue about, but I wouldn't be confident to say that.
All right. And then if I ask you please to just look at figure 6. Sorry, that's on page 45.
Okay. Oh.
Sorry, apologies.
Oh,
Again, I'm not, this is obviously very technical, but you said just a bit earlier that when you look at underlying tables, there is, that they also perhaps reveal a cause for concern. And I just wanted to check, first of all, is this one of the tables that provides that cause for concern?
It is.
All right. And again, if you could just tell us in headline why that's the case, that would be helpful.
Yeah. So again, we're looking at, what's useful is we're looking at data for the same age range as we were in the previous tables. So we're comparing like with like in that way. We're looking at the percentage of pupils reaching the expected standard in reading, writing and maths. So it's a kind of a combination. It's across the piece rather than an individual subject. And probably the thing to do that might be most useful is if we look along the bottom, we can see these numbers 16, 18, 20, 22 and 24 along the bottom refer to, so that's 2016 through to 2024. And really I think probably one of the things to do is to look at what's happening just before just as we go into the pandemic. So if we look at the situation for, if we look at the first box, we've got, for example, we've got the blue line, which has been sitting at, say, 55% of pupils reaching the expected standard in reading, writing and maths, children from an Asian background. Yep.
Yeah.
Thanks. And then we'll take out the pandemic. And then when we start in 2022, we can see it's lower and it starts to improve. But I think we can also see that it does not yet return to the level it was at just before the pandemic. And then if we take that same approach and look across all the other boxes, we can see similar patterns, not exactly the same, and some of them are actually more concerning and some less, but overall that's the way that there is this things improving. But actually that word I used earlier was stagnation. You can see in each of the cases, I think I'm right in saying that actually it was just starting to tail off. That improvement was starting to tail off before 2020, and that has continued. But it's, there are some improvements, but it has not gone back up overall.
All right. And I won't take you to this now. Thank you. That can come down. But I think in the rest of the extract you've been given, there's also data for Key Stage 4 as well and the disadvantage gap.
Yeah.
And I think, if I just take it at headline level, in 2017 to 2018, the disadvantage gap index was 3.68, and in 23-24 it's 3.92. So again, is that a similar
Yeah.
point? It's still higher than it was pre-pandemic.
Yes, although I don't know how much detail you want to go into. I'm wary of going into too much detail, so I'll just stop there.
I think it's just the headline
Yeah,
that
that's
really
fine.
matters.
Yeah, okay.
And I think, again, I won't take you to it, but there's a key stage 4 of the same table that we've just looked at figure 8, which sets out attainment by ethnicity, disadvantage and gender. Can I just check whether or not that follows the same sorts of patterns that you pointed out in relation to table 8?
Yes, in general terms, yeah.
All right, thank you. And can I just then, coming back to the sorts of, because you've touched on this lightly as we've gone through your evidence, and I just want to come back to it. Some of the things that may have worked during the pandemic in helping children to maintain their education or to maintain attainment. Can I just come back then and ask you about that and what it is, in your opinion, that you think may have worked at any point during the pandemic?
Some of these are double-edged swords. I mean, the opportunity for live online learning, if I've understood your question correctly,
Yes.
clearly helped engagement for many children and returned them to something close to the experience of being in the same place at the same time as their peers and the school staff, and that was hugely important. So again, thinking towards the future, it's something that that will hopefully provide a central focus for planning. But I think we just know much more now about what kind of mitigations we also would want to put in place to ensure that opportunity is there for all, not just for those who are already well able to take it on.
All right, and I think you've set out a very long list of recommendations as to what you think might be needed in a future pandemic. But I mean, is it right to say that a lot of those recommendations are focused on pre-planning and having very specific plans in contemplation in order, for example, that sort of provision be much more readily available to more children?
Yes, I think it's been important to try and set out some of the detail of that, partly because we already know a huge amount about what works well and in which circumstances and with which schools, with which children. So we're not starting from scratch when we set out those recommendations. Much of the information we have is already at our disposal. So it is about planning, but it is also about remedying the situation that schools had as they went into it. Because with all the planning in the world, it won't make any difference if the sense of crisis that schools were experiencing is not addressed as part of that. And that's why the first recommendation I make is to ensure that schools are properly supported and resourced and feel that, that they themselves would agree that they are properly supported and resourced to do the job they want to do and are trained to do. Without that, the planning won't help.
My lady, those are all of my questions. I think that there is one from a core participant.
There is. I think, Mr. Jacobs, you have one question.
I do. It may in part have been answered by the closing comment just given. But, Professor, just one question on behalf of the Trade Union Congress, if I may. You've described in your report how unless, and just in your evidence, how unless the crisis in education is tackled urgently, schools will be unprepared for any future pandemic with long-lasting social and economic consequences. Is it possible to tease out what it is about the crisis in education that had a particular bearing on the ability of schools to respond in the pandemic and on the outcomes for children?
One of the phrases I've used in the report is that we had a system under stress. And so it's certainly possible and indeed necessary to tease out what those aspects of those stresses were. They were certainly financial. I've been quite clear in the report that the declining funding arrangements in the years leading up to the pandemic made a massive difference. We could see that working through in terms of school infrastructure, physical infrastructure, digital infrastructure, and commitment to, planning of all kinds, and to teacher recruitment and retention, head teacher and school leader recruitment and retention, shortages in specific subjects. We know the list of things. We know the things that were causing immense difficulty. So I think that crisis is still with us. And I am worried that unless that's said really clearly, we won't be starting from a good place to think about what planning we need for the future. It will just take away from the plans we make. It'll make them worthless. I think one of the other things that I do emphasise as well, and I want to say it again, is that can only be done in partnership. There's no one part of the ecosystem of schools has the right answer. I appreciate you're speaking from a TUC point of view, but I do think that there have been so many missed opportunities to ensure that the voices of children and young people and their families are included in decision making in really authentic ways. And that systems, all the different parts of the system work much better together, all the key stakeholders. There's a lot of lip service paid to it, but I do not think we are yet at the point where we can say it's working well.
Thank you. Thank you, Milady.
Thank you very much indeed, Ms Jacobs. But I think that's probably the note to end on, Professor. Thank you very much indeed for your help with the inquiry, both today and obviously in preparing your very helpful report. Don't panic if you think we haven't covered something, or Ms Dobbin hasn't covered something today, because I promise you we do take into account all the written material as well as the oral evidence. Would you also please pass on my thanks to your colleagues who helped you prepare the report. So I'm really grateful to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Milady.
Very well, I shall return at 10 o'clock tomorrow.